Recently released Dietary Guidelines for Americans will set the stage for federal nutrition standards for the next 5 years. Happily, dairy continues to be a standalone food group, along with meats, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. To talk more about the guidelines and how dairy is seen today as a healthy food is Katie Brown, a registered dietitian and Vice President of Scientific Affairs and Outreach at the National Dairy Council. Welcome to Dairy Business Update, Katie. We're glad you could be with us today.
Thank you, Joel.
To get us started, why don't you put the guidelines in perspective for us? Exactly what is the influence of this document?
Thanks. It's great to be with you to share the good news for dairy in the latest edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. For background, Joel, the aim of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is to promote public health and prevent disease. And as you noted, the guidelines are the cornerstone of official government guidance on eating recommendations. And these recommendations are aligned with many federal nutrition programs, including the National School Meal Programs, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, and the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, or WIC. And to give a perspective for dairy, the federal feeding programs resulted in 10.7 billion pounds of milk, 684 million pounds of cheese, and 662 million pounds of yogurt and other dairy foods in fiscal year 2019. And as you noted, the dietary guidelines are updated on a 5-year cycle. The latest edition, the 2020-2025 guidelines, were just released a few weeks ago. They held good news for dairy. And just to briefly recap that good news, dairy was once again singled out as its own food group alongside the fruits, vegetables, grains, and protein food groups. As in previous editions of the dietary guidelines, dairy is included in all 3 recommended healthy eating patterns: the healthy US, the healthy Mediterranean, and the healthy vegetarian eating pattern. The guidelines reiterate that dairy foods are a nutrient-rich core component of these dietary patterns, and the science indicates that these eating styles are linked with positive health and disease prevention. Specifically, a healthy diet, which includes low-fat and fat-free dairy foods, are associated with reducing your risk for heart disease, overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, certain types of cancer, and improved bone health. And for the first time ever, yogurt and cheese are recommended as complementary foods to introduce to infants starting at about 6 months of age, and whole-fat dairy milk is recommended to be introduced at 1 year of age. This is all very good news for dairy, as you noted, and these recommendations will continue to be in place for the next 5 years. It's also important to note, Joel, that the dietary guidelines are grounded in sound science and focus on public health, and this aligns with National Dairy Council's commitment to peer-reviewed research on dairy's contributions to nutrition and health, reflected by the Dairy Checkoff investment in science to ensure good nutrition across the lifespan for all Americans.
Well, good news indeed. Katie, it seems like there is more and more research showing that dairy fat is different in kind from so-called saturated fats that have been seen as causing heart problems and other health issues. What are some of the new developments here?
Yeah, you're right, Joel. There's some room for optimism here. National Dairy Council and other credible nutrition research organizations recognize a growing body of research that links milk, cheese, and yogurt, regardless of fat content, to health benefits. We noted this benefit with its association with bone health, especially in children and adolescents. And there's an association with dairy consumption and reduced risk of heart disease and type 2 diabetes, along with lower blood pressure in adults. But the counter or larger argument, as you're bringing up, is about avoiding too much total fat and saturated fat in the diet. And there's about 5 decades worth of research on that topic, which is why fat-free and low-fat versions of milk and dairy foods are recommended in the dietary guidelines, for example. However, the newer research on saturated fat is starting to tell us a little different story. In recent years, position statements have come from authoritative organizations like the Australian Heart Foundation, the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation, and the well-renowned Joslin Diabetes Center here in the US, which acknowledge the importance of the quality of dietary fats. They encourage milk, cheese, and yogurt in their recommended healthy eating patterns, and they allow for more saturated fats than in their previous guidelines. And the science community is taking note and is exploring and building the body of evidence in this area. For example, a National Dairy Council over the past decade has funded over 70 studies in this area. Now, many of these studies look at milk, cheese, and yogurt at a variety of fat levels. So that would include lower fat and whole fat milk and dairy foods in the same study. And the benefit there is that we're able to demonstrate that the good results are happening at all fat levels.
With that in mind, can you foresee a day, maybe for the next 5-year edition, when full-fat dairy might be recommended or at least allowed in federal nutrition programs?
Well, we're making great progress, and the pendulum is shifting on whole fat and whole milk dairy research, but more research is needed. It will take a good deal of time to keep exploring these newer findings that indicate that saturated fat may not be the issue it once was thought to be, at least in healthy individuals, and why we continue to invest in the science of the uniqueness of dairy foods, including the unique health effects of saturated fats in dairy foods. You know, in the current edition of the dietary guidelines, there is flexibility to consume up to 10% of our total calories from food sources containing saturated fat. So within this flexibility, one serving of full-fat dairy can fit within these parameters. But certainly consumers are interested, and the shift to more fat flexibility in the dairy group is already happening in the marketplace based on consumer shopping trends. According to IRI data, for example, 70% of households purchased whole milk in the past year, and whole milk experienced the greatest growth of any milk fat level in 2020. And that's a great reinforcement that the tide is turning in this area.
Well, let's hope those trends continue. In the guidelines, how about plant-based beverages? How are they evaluated? How are they treated in the new document?
Yeah, it's good you brought this up, Joel. The dietary guidelines make it clear that all milks are not equal. Dairy stands alone as its own food group for a reason, you know, because it's tough to match its nutrient package elsewhere. And as in the past editions of the dietary guidelines, the only dairy alternative recognized by the guidelines are fortified soy beverages. All other plant-based milk alternatives are expressly not included in the dairy group because their overall nutrient content doesn't stack up to dairy milk and fortified soy beverages.
Well, I think we can take some satisfaction in that. As we do wrap up, what are some of the new areas of research that excite you as you look ahead in your position?
Yeah, well, you know, the DGAs are a year-round focus for us at National Dairy Council, and dairy farmers make it possible for us to succeed. We have, you know, NDC has this long legacy of supporting peer-reviewed research that's shared as part of the DGA public process. And we also present that dairy research far and wide to members of the scientific community, to health and wellness professionals, and to consumers in ways that are meaningful and applicable. So looking ahead to the 2025-2030 dietary guidelines, we anticipate that the next committee may consider looking at the food matrix and fat flexibility, health disparities and food insecurity, as well as sustainable food systems. So, you know, we're taking note of all of that. NDC will continue our research on whole milk dairy foods, as well as inflammation and dairy's links to reduce risk of chronic disease like heart disease and type 2 diabetes. We know that research will continue to be important. We're also interested in the science about how dairy contributes in other ways to consumer wellness, areas like digestive health and lactose intolerance, energy sustaining, and healthy immune function, for example. And we're considering research opportunities in the intersection of personal health and agricultural sustainability. You know, as the dairy community sharpens its focus on sustainability, we're ready to address how dairy foods can contribute to health and sustainable food systems.
Well, Katie, thank you very much. We've been speaking with Katie Brown of the National Dairy Council, and we are glad that she was able to share her message with us today. I'm Joel Hastings for Dairy Business Update, dairybusiness.com.